So I'm very happy to present you today. Thanks a lot for being here. So I have a little bio, so I'll look at it because I don't want to miss anything. So we have with us Nadine. I'm not sure about how pronouncing your name correctly.
It's Nadine Dijkstra.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure you're much better than I would. So in French Quebecer, people never know how to pronounce my name, so I don't feel shy to ask because it's always a problem with my name here in Quebec. So, Nadine completed her PhD with Professor Marcel van Gerven in artificial intelligence at Donders Institute in Netherlands. And she used machine learning techniques to understand the neural overlap between imagery and perception. And after her PhD, she moved to UCL in the UK to pursue postdoctoral research with Professor Stephen Fleming and Dr. Peter Koch to study perceptual reality monitoring. So given the large neural overlap between imagery and perception, how does the brain distinguish these two things is a subject of interest for her. So to investigate this, they used during a postdoc a combination of computational modeling, psychophysics, neuroimaging, and machine learning. So it's very in the heart of what we are interested in Cerebrum. So we're very, very happy to welcome you here today. Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot because I know it's very late for you on a Friday night. So thanks.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for the great introduction. Well, it's 8 p.m., which is not that late, but it's a bit late to be working maybe. But I mean, 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon is also not the best time. So thanks everybody for being here. I can't share my screen, so I think maybe you need to allow that somehow so I can share my slides.
I think you can now, but
yeah.
I'm not sure that I have this. Okay.
Let's see. Does this work? Oh, it's loading.
Yeah.
Cool. Nice.
Yeah,
and now you see the screen, but not my presenter view, right? Not my notes, I think. Okay, perfect. Okay. Hi, everybody. So yeah, thanks for making it today. As Anne said, I'm going to talk about some of our research on maybe constraints that are in the brain that could prevent us from distinguishing reality from imagination, and why don't they usually? Why are we usually good at telling whether something is real or imagined? If at any point during the talk anything's unclear or you have any questions, then I'm very happy for you to interrupt me. It's nice if this is interactive, but otherwise it's also fine to just wait until the end. So whatever works for you. Let me see. Okay, yeah, before I start, I usually start with thanking everybody who helped me because, science is a collaborative effort. So I want to especially thank Marcel van Gerven, who taught me about the usefulness of using AI to study cognition, and Steve Fleming, who taught me that the brain is not just the visual cortex, but there's actually more going on, which is good to be reminded of sometimes. Okay, so a large part of our conscious experience is determined by what is happening in the external world, right? Our visual system rapidly processes different colors and shapes to create the technicolor reality that we experience every day, right? For example, when we're listening to an interesting talk, our brain is engaged in trying to make sense of that. But no matter how interesting this talk is that we're listening to, we are often still caught up in internal processes, right? So we might, for example, be thinking about what we're going to have for dinner later that evening, or we're remembering on the very cool holiday that we've just recently been on. And for most people, these kind of internal thoughts are associated with mental imagery or seeing with the mind's eye. And today I'm going to talk about how reality and imagination interact in the brain to determine our conscious experience. So I'm going to talk about two main parts. In the first part, I'll talk about the neural overlap between imagery and perception. I'll mention some neural decoding work that has shown that imagined stimuli are represented very similarly as perceived stimuli in the brain. And then I'll discuss about the underlying neural dynamics and how these might differ between during perception and imagery. And then in the second part of the talk, I'll discuss how perceptual reality monitoring might work. Given this large overlap between imagery and perception, how does the brain keep the two apart? I'll start with a bit of a theoretical background on how intention and sensory strength might play a role here. And in that context, I'll also mention a very old experiment on reality monitoring where they use this magical lantern to investigate imagination. So stay tuned for that. You have to pay attention until the end to learn about this magical lantern. I'll also discuss some of our computational modeling work and psychophysics work that we've done to kind of answer this question and tease apart different hypotheses. And I'll end with a more kind of recent model that's still very much in progress on how we can maybe think about perceptual reality monitoring as an essential part of perceptual inference within a Bayesian predictive processing architecture. Okay, so there are lots of studies that have investigated the overlap in neural representations of imagined and perceived stimuli, because, you know, mental imagery is also talked about as seeing with the mind's eye. So the question to what extent this is similar to actual seeing has been occupying researchers for quite a long time. And this cross-decoding is one of the methods that people tend to use to investigate this. So I'm just looking in the room. Who of you is familiar with cross-decoding? Can you hold up your hands? Few hands. Who of you has no idea what I'm talking about? Cross-decoding. Oh, so few hands. Okay, that's good to know. So yeah, so the basic idea of these techniques is you train a classifier, which is just a computer model, to distinguish between the perception of, for example, a face and a house based on brain activity. So you're training a model to find connections between brain activity and the perception of a specific stimulus. So this classifier is then able to, you know, look at brain activity and say, oh, the person was seeing a face at this time, or oh, the person was seeing a house at this time. Now, the idea of cross-decoding is that you use this perception classifier, in this case, and then you test it on imagery. So you see if your perception classifier can classify what people were imagining just by looking at the brain activity at that time. When they were imagining this. And the idea is that if you can significantly cross-decode, so if you can use your perception classifier to predict what people were imagining, then that means that the underlying brain activity during perception and imagery was to some extent similar, that there was an overlap in the underlying neural representations of the perceived and imagined stimuli. So this is a technique that's been used quite a lot to look at overlap between image and perception, with the idea being that if you can significantly cross-decode, then that means that the imagery representations are perception-like, right? So lots of people have done this in the past couple of decades, and there tends to be quite a substantial high-level overlap. So when you use this technique on a whole brain scan, you usually find very strong overlap in kind of LOC, high-level visual cortex. And we also applied this to some MAG data, so at different time points. You don't have to understand everything in the graph here, but basically what we show here on the x-axis is the time during perception, and the y-axis is the time during imagery. And what we see is that imagery overlaps with perceptual processing starting from about 150 milliseconds, so kind of high-level and late perceptual processing. But importantly, in this in both of these studies, we used quite high-level stimuli like objects and faces and houses. And then if you look at studies that use more low-level stimuli like gratings, they also tend to find reliable overlap even in V1. So when you ask people to imagine gratings, V1 represents these imagined gratings in similar ways as perceived gratings. And this is even the case when people are simultaneously looking at different things. So this is cross-decoding accuracy of imagined gratings. And then while people are also, for example, looking at another grating or at some noise, and you see that there's still significant cross-decoding of the imagined stimulus. So that suggests that the imagery, or what we are imagining, is represented in a very similar way as what we are perceiving throughout our visual cortex, right? And moreover, another important thing here is that the overlap with perception, specifically in these low-level visual areas, seems to be modulated by imagery vividness. So there's a lot of variation between people, but also within people in how vivid their mental imagery is. So, you know, when I ask you, imagine an apple, who of you would say that their imagined apple is as vivid as if they were actually looking at an apple? Anybody has really, really vivid imagery? No. Who of you is like, well, I don't really see anything? It's like, it's just the idea of an apple, but I don't really have a picture in my mind. Is there anybody? And who of you would say, well, when I imagine an apple, it's kind of like I'm seeing it, but kind of not really, but it's like a vague kind of experience. Yeah, that's most people, right? Yeah, so for most people, vividness of imagery is just kind of like perception, but a little bit less vivid. But there are big differences between people and how vivid your mental imagery is. And it turns out that these differences are correlated with this cross-decoding overlap in early visual areas. So for example, these two studies looked at the VVIQ in this case and some kind of measure of imagery vividness or accuracy. And they both found that the higher the cross-decoding overlap, the more vivid the mental imagery was. And we also showed that this is also the case between trials. So at some moments, your Apple imagination is going to be more vivid than at other moments. And this also correlates with how perception-like these neural representations in early visual areas are. So imagery seems to rely on similar neural representations as perception. However, the ways in which these representations are instantiated is presumably very different, right? Because during perception, activity in the visual cortex is ultimately caused by bottom-up signals from the retina. And these signals are initially processed in a feed-forward manner, starting in low-level visual cortex and then spreading towards more high-level visual areas over time. In contrast, during imagery, there is no bottom-up input, right? By definition, imagery is about things that are not present currently in the environment. So how do these visual neural representations come about? Now, we initially set out to investigate this question using dynamic causal modeling, or DCM, on fMRI data. So DCM allows you to quantify large-scale brain dynamics by defining models of how different brain regions interact with each other, which are then transferred to predict bolt activity via some kind of hemodynamic response model. So basically, you can come up with different hypotheses about how different brain regions talk to each other during perception and imagery, and then test these using your fMRI data. And what we found doing this analysis was that during perception, there's both bottom-up as well as top-down connectivity. Let me just double check. Can you see my cursor on the screen? Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, so this is the early visual cortex, and we found, arrows going out of the early visual cortex and arrows coming into the early visual cortex. So both bottom-up as well as top-down connectivity. But during imagery, we only found evidence for top-down connectivity, with especially strong coupling between frontal and early visual areas. Interestingly, this same connection between the frontal cortex and the early visual cortex was also present during perception. Now, we finally also found that imagery vividness specifically was modulated by local top-down connectivity within the visual system, again, highlighting this importance of early visual processing in imagery vividness. Now, this is all great, but ultimately what we really want to know is how sensory information flows through the brain. And these kinds of dynamics happen within hundreds of milliseconds, which is much too fast for fMRI to really look at. Oh, I just got a thing that the cursor doesn't appear on Zoom. Okay, let me see if I can do something. Does this help? Can you now see the cursor?
Yes, I can see it now on Zoom.
Okay, amazing. Then I'll keep it like this. Awesome. Okay. So basically, what we were really interested in is figuring out how this sensory processing happens during imagery. And fMRI can't really capture this, no matter how fancy your DCM model is. This is something that just happens really fast. And the fMRI response is going to be too slow to capture this. So we came up with 3 different hypotheses regarding how sensory information might flow during imagery. So let me see if I can. Yeah, there we go. So the first option is that, after activity might, for example, be triggered by frontal regions, after that, it just proceeds in the same bottom-up fashion as during perception, right? In a feed-forward manner. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that because you don't have any input during imagery, activity might start at high-level visual areas and then flow down in a reversed order. And finally, the last option is that during imagery, the whole neural representation just is reinstated instantaneously, and there's no clear order in activity, right? Maybe it's just, you have some kind of trace that represents your imagined stimulus, and it just gets reactivated at once. Maybe all brain areas are connected to the hippocampus in some way that you can just get this kind of instantaneous instantiation. So we wanted to arbitrate between these 3 hypotheses. Now, to answer this question, what we need to know is both where and when these imagined stimuli were represented. which is something that's notoriously difficult to investigate with neuroimaging methods, right? Because fMRI is good for knowing where something happens, but it has bad temporal resolution. And MAG and EAG is good for deciding when something happens, but it has, less good spatial resolution. So the way we kind of circumvented this was using MAG data and then taking classifiers that were trained at different time points during the early stages of perception as proxies for activation in areas within the visual hierarchy. So the idea was that early time points during perception, so about 70 to 80 milliseconds after stimulus onset, we took to represent activity in low-level visual cortex. And this is something that we know from intracranial recordings and stuff like that. And then we took later time points up until about 150 milliseconds as models for kind of later levels of processing, right? And then the idea was that we could test these perception models, which represented different kind of visual areas, on imagery to infer when they became reactivated during imagery. So we tested each of these classifiers to obtain during imagery to obtain classifier evidence for each trial, for each time point. And then for each perception classifier, we picked the peak evidence time during imagery, right? And we did this per trial. There's some technical reasons for this, which is that you expect that there's going to be some jitter in the exact activation in the exact timing of activation during imagery. So we expect imagery to be less time locked than perception, and that's why we did this per trial. It's not super important now, but just for those of you who are interested. But basically what this allows us is to give for each perception classifier time, a time of when it becomes reactivated during imagery. And if there's a specific order in which these perception time points become reactivated, then that tells us something about the direction of information flow. So specifically, if representations during imagery are activated in a feed-forward manner, just like perception, you would expect to see a positive relationship between perception classifier model time and imagery reactivation time. So that during imagery, the early perceptual representations become active before the late perceptual representations. Does that make sense? Because this logic is quite important for understanding the rest of the... I see some nodding in the front. Okay. That's good enough for me. So then if instead there's a reversal, you would expect to see a negative relationship, right? Then now instead, you would expect that during imagery, early during the imagery time, late perceptual processes become active, and later during imagery, early perceptual processes become active. So that would be the case if you get this reversal. And finally, if there's no clear order, there should be no principled relationship between perception time and imagery time, right? Because it should just be kind of random or instantaneous. So that's the basic idea. Is this all clear? Checking if there's questions.
It is for me.
Okay, okay. That's good. Yeah, it's a bit difficult with such a big audience in person. It's hard maybe to ask spontaneous questions, but that's all good. Okay, cool. So this is what we found, which was not a surprise to anybody, but we still needed to look at it. Is basically a very clear negative relationship in line with this kind of reversal of information flow, excuse me. So we next confirmed these results by realigning the activity based on the identified reactivation times, and then used source reconstructions to identify stimulus representations in low and high level visual cortex during imagery. And we found that indeed stimulus representations were present in inferior temporal cortex before they were present in the early visual cortex, confirming this idea that you get this reversal of information flow during imagery. Cool. So this suggests that imagery is kind of like reversed perception, right? Which sounds pretty cool and kind of makes sense, but we all know that feedback and top-down processing is also actually an internal or an integral part of perception. So for the previous analysis, we only looked at the first 150 milliseconds during perception. So that's this, right? And we know that this kind of represents the feed-forward sweep during perception, which is, from previous research, we know that this is kind of how this works. And we found that this was negatively correlated with imagery, so that activity flows in a feedback direction during imagery. So that's kind of how we can make this conclusion in the first place, because we know how it works during perception, and then we can infer that during imagery, apparently it's the other way around. But now what happens at later stages, right? If we also sometimes see positive correlations between imagery reactivation time and perception time, then this would be indicative of feedback sweeps during perception, right? So we just decided to look at that more exploratory, and this is what we found. So we were actually quite surprised by this because this is such a clear oscillation, right? So this really suggests maybe that during the first kind of half a second of perception, there's this iteration between feed forward and feedback sweeps. And when we quantified the frequency power of this trace, we indeed found a strong alpha peak, which was not present when we permuted the class labels of the data. So this suggests that this is really an oscillation in the information flow during perception. So it's not just a raw alpha signal. We checked for that. We did some control analysis, but it's really about kind of how stimulus information flows through the brain during perception. So this is really neat and neatly in line with some predictive processing ideas on how, you know, feedback predictions are maybe implemented in alpha oscillations. So yeah, we were quite excited about these data in this case. So our data seem to suggest that during imagery, we only have feedback processing, right? Now, this has two important consequences for the resulting sensory representations during imagery. So first of all, because of this lack of bottom-up input, the middle layer of the primary visual cortex, which is the layer that contains the most excitatory neurons, is not activated during imagery. And some recent laminar fMRI studies indeed seem to confirm that this is the case. And this means that there are lower firing rates overall during imagery. So during imagery, you have a lower amplitude signal. So even though you do get activation in the visual cortex during imagery, the amplitude of the activation tends to be much lower. And that's probably a direct consequence of the fact that you don't have any bottom-up input. And secondly, because the signal originates from high-level cortex during imagery, right? You have feedback, it comes from high-level cortex. And the high-level cortex contains large receptive fields. We think that this also causes the functional receptive fields in low-level areas to be larger during imagery. So for example, this is a study of memory, but similar findings were found in imagery as well, where the receptive fields of early visual cortex during, you know, perception are very small. But then if you look at the same voxels during memory, they are much, much larger. And this cannot be explained by noise or anything. It seems that the functional receptive fields are just larger during imagery, which means that even though, again, you get activation throughout the whole visual system, the activation tends to be less precise as well. So taking all of this together, what is the neural overlap between imagery and perception? So I would say that imagery and perception use the same visual system, but they do so in slightly different ways. So during perception, we have both bottom-up and top-down processing. Signals come into the brain at the input layers of V1, which consists of mostly excitatory neurons, and low-level areas contain small receptive fields. Together, this means that sensory signals during perception are strong and precise, leading to a rich, precise, and vivid experience of external reality. Now, in contrast, during imagery, there is no bottom-up input. So to generate sensory signals, everything needs to come from the top down. And because these signals originate from high-level visual cortex, which contains larger receptive fields, the precision is lower throughout the system. And furthermore, they only target these kind of modulatory layers, leading to lower firing rates overall as well. So this causes sensory representations to be weaker and less precise, which I think is what is leading to our less clear and less vivid visual experience of mental imagery. Now, before I continue, this is kind of the end of the first part. Does anybody have any questions about this bit over here? Either I was just super clear or I was just super unclear.
On my side, it was really clear, but I don't see the room very well. So if Frédéric, you can look if there are questions or.
No questions?
I don't know if the room is talking, but we can.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah, they are too small.
You are also muted, so if
Can
somebody...
you hear us?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
now we can. Now we can,
Okay.
yeah.
So usually we ask questions at the end, so hopefully people will wake up by the time your talk is over. I have
Okay,
a few
sure.
questions for you, so don't worry, you'll have questions.
Okay, sure, that's fine. Okay, then I'll just keep going, just because this is kind of the end of the first part. I wanted to check in, but okay, I'll keep going. So let me just make you smaller. Okay, cool. So given that bottom up and top down signals are actually completely intermixed within the system, right? They both use the same system. How does our brain keep track of which of these signals reflect imagination and which of them are actually real? Now, in the last couple of years, we've identified a few possibilities for how the brain might, separate imagination and reality. So the first one is, maybe there's not really a problem. So we might see some overlap when we look at the brain using something like MAG or fMRI, but these are just pretty coarse neuroimaging tools. And in fact, maybe different neurons are actually activated during imagery and perception. So for example, the middle layer of V1, like I said, is not activated during imagery. So maybe the brain could just use the middle layer activity as a tag, whether something is real or not, right? So maybe if there is activity in the middle layer, we say something is real, and otherwise we say it's imagined. And there's not, this is a very simple solution to the problem, or maybe that's not a problem in the first place. So this is going to be our null hypothesis for how perceptual reality monitoring works. Just different populations for imagery and perception. Now, our second hypothesis is based on the fact that there is more top-down control during imagery compared to perception. So this is something that's been found in different studies. So maybe the brain could use this as a way to do reality monitoring, right? So for example, maybe these increased top-down signals are due to the fact that imagery is often intentional. So we have an intention to imagine, and maybe the brain can just tag all sensory signals associated with that intention as imagery or as imagination. Now, finally, we've also seen that due to the neural wiring, the sensory representations tend to be a lot weaker during imagery, right? So maybe a simple way to do reality monitoring is just monitoring sensory strength. Now, over the past few years, Steve Fleming and me have tested these hypotheses against each other using a combination of computational modeling and psychophysics, which is what I'm going to talk to you about now. So we tried to create computational models of each of these hypotheses using signal detection theory. So the first hypothesis predicted there's no reality monitoring problem because imagination and reality rely on different populations, and that's why we don't confuse them. So the way that we modeled this was by simply having kind of two different nodes, an imagery node and a perception node, that do not have any interactions between them. So these two nodes are both multivariate Gaussians, which allows us to model different stimuli. It's not very important, but the basic thing is that we can set their mean and variance according to different hypotheses and then sample values from them. And the idea is that the vividness of imagery is determined by samples from the imagery distribution, and the probability that we see something as real is determined by samples drawn from the perception distribution. So the perception part here is just classic signal detection theory for anybody who is familiar with this. So if you draw a sample that's above a threshold or criterion, you say a signal is present, and otherwise you say you don't see anything. So that's the basic idea. Now, according to our second hypothesis, top-down control is used to explain away sensory signals caused by imagery. Now, the psychological equivalent of this would be, I know I'm imagining something, so whatever I see must be imagined because I have this intention and I can use this intention to keep it apart from reality. There is some really interesting anecdotal evidence that this kind of explaining away happens, and this comes from the Perky effect, the Perky effect. So who of you is familiar with the Perky effect? Anybody knows this effect? No? Nobody? Oh, this is so sad. I feel like this should be textbook psychology knowledge, but it isn't for some reason. Maybe I'm going to remedy that throughout my career. But anyway, so this is as the first experimental study of imagination, which was done in 1910 by Mary Cheeves West Perky. And it's really cool. So what she did is she asked participants to come to her lab. This was in the US. And they sat down in a chair, and then she asked them to imagine different objects while looking at a certain location on the wall. So they were asked to kind of imagery project these objects onto the wall, for example, an apple, and then they had to tell her what they were experiencing. So they would, you know, if she asked them to imagine an apple, they would say something like, "Oh yeah, I'm seeing this like reddish round shape, and you know, it's kind of flickering in and out," or whatever. They were just describing their imagery experience. Now, at the same time, she had this magic lantern hidden away in the lab, and she used this to secretly present congruent sensory shapes at exactly the same location on the wall. So when people were imagining an apple, she would kind of present this vague red circle at exactly the same location. Now, what happened is that all of the participants were like, "Whoa, my imagination is so vivid. I didn't know I could do this. I've never experienced such vivid imagery before, but I've also never really tried." So these people really thought that they had such vivid imagery that they could create experiences that were like a projection from an external machine. So people said something like, "If I hadn't known I was imagining this apple, I would have thought it was really there." So this is a case where people kind of mistook these external projections to be the result of their imagination. And the way that we can explain this in a model is to suggest that maybe there's a suppressive connection between imagery and perception. So that when the imagery node has the same value as the perception node, so when you're imagining an apple and you're seeing a red circle, which is similar, then it decreases the probability that you say that you saw a real stimulus, right? So that's kind of how we're modeling that here. So the imagery intention explains away any sensory signal in line with that intention. And this is, you know, usually you don't imagine things that are also presented. So that's how your brain could keep the two apart. So all of your signals that are imagined are kind of tagged as being imagery. Now, the final hypothesis suggests that, you know, imagery and perception do activate the same population, but because imagery by itself tends to be so much weaker than perception, it's not really a problem, right? So only when something is very vivid, we think it's real. So the way we implemented this is now having one node, which is both activated by imagery and perception, and then whether we think it's real or not is determined by whether the mixture of these two signals crosses some threshold. So imagery, vividness, and perceptual reality are based on the same signal, but that signal, when you only have imagery, is never strong enough to cross this threshold. That's the idea. So, inspired by Perky's experiment where participants did not know that real stimuli could be presented to them, we developed a one-trial psychophysics paradigm to arbitrate between these three hypotheses. So the idea is that if participants would know that a real stimulus could be presented to them, you know, if in standard psychophysics, then their attention could be biased externally. So they would be looking for the stimulus, and they might therefore be more likely to respond seeing a real stimulus. So then you get issues like response biases or demand characteristics. So we didn't want to use multiple trials because, you know, once they see it on the first trial or on any other trial, all of the other trials are biased. So we wanted to do a kind of a one trial experiment. So in this experiment, participants were asked to imagine left or right tilted gratings while looking at dynamic noise, and then indicating how vivid their imagery was after every trial. So we presented this dynamic noise to them, and we instructed them to imagine as if gratings were appearing within the noise, so as if they were really presented on the screen, and then indicate how vivid they could do this after each trial. So they imagined this same grating and rated their vividness for a few trials in a row, and then on the last kind of critical trial, we secretly also faded in a real stimulus that was either congruent or incongruent to the one they were imagining. And the participants again rated their imagery vividness. So from the participants' perspective, this last trial was the same as all of the other trials. But then after that, we asked, hey, on the last trial, did you see a real stimulus, or was anything you saw only imagined? So this is kind of an unbiased measure of reality monitoring, where you have both imagery and reality, and then the question is whether participants confuse the two or not. So each of these models make different predictions about what happens on this last trial. And we could run some simulations with these models to kind of generate predicted results. So according to our null model, there's no interaction between the imagery and perception signals, right? So whether imagery and perception is the same or not, whether they are congruent or not, should not really influence either the vividness ratings or the reality judgments, right? Because there's no interaction between the two. So again, the percentage of real judgments should be the same during congruent and incongruent conditions, and there shouldn't really be any change in vividness ratings for congruent or incongruent conditions, or for reality or imagination judgments. Now, in contrast, according to the top-down control model, when the imagery signal is congruent to the perception signal, it should be attributed to imagery. So the probability of saying that you see a real stimulus should be lower during the congruent condition. So this is inspired by Perky's study. And in line with Perky's study, you would also expect that when people say that they saw that the stimulus was imagined, even though a real stimulus was faded in, their vividness should be much higher, because this kind of external input feeds into the imagery vividness rating. Now, the sensory strength makes exactly the opposite prediction, right? According to this model, when imagery and perception are the same, the total strength will be stronger. So this should lead to a higher percentage of reality judgments. And furthermore, perhaps counterintuitively, this model predicts that when participants would say they see a real stimulus, the imagery vividness should be higher, because according to this model, imagery vividness is based on the same exact signal as a reality judgment is. So these are our three hypotheses. Who thinks that we found the top-down control model? Nobody. Yeah. 1, 2. Nice. Who thinks the sensory strength model? Most. Lots of people. Who thinks the null model? No, otherwise it wouldn't be an Nature Communications publication. No. Yeah. So what did we find? We found the sensory strength model. So again, we found that reality judgments were higher in the congruent condition, exactly in line with this model, and that the vividness ratings were higher for reality judgments. Now you could maybe argue, okay, well, maybe congruent imagery kind of just increased attention, right? Leading to an increase in detection responses. And maybe this increase in vividness ratings is just because participants got confused. So once they saw a real stimulus, they just rated the vividness of their perception and not their imagery. So according to this interpretation, people are actually able to keep apart imagery and perception, but they just kind of got confused about our instructions. Now, to control for this, we repeated this experiment, but now we did not show a stimulus on the last trial, but we still asked participants whether a real stimulus was shown or not. And then sometimes participants will make a false alarm. So they will say that they saw a real stimulus, even though none was there. And these different models still make different predictions about what will happen to the vividness ratings on those false alarms, right? So importantly, the sensory strength model says, you know, you can make false alarms, but that has to be because your imagery for some reason was too vivid. And this is, again, exactly what we found. So yeah, this suggests kind of that maybe one way in which the brain could keep apart imagination and reality is just using sensory strength. And then if a signal becomes very strong or very vivid, you could get imagery to be mistaken for reality, at least in these very ambiguous, kind of uncertain situations. Now, how might this be implemented in the brain? So I've already provided some evidence that the sensory strength kind of the model is determined by sensory processes. So, you know, more vivid imagery is associated with more perception-like sensory processing. And in general, we know that during perception, the strength of a stimulus or the strength of our perception is correlated with sensory signals in visual areas, right? But now, how does this lead to reality judgments? Is this something that just arises from these differences? Or is there some other region that kind of monitors sensory processing to determine whether signals reflect reality or not? So that's kind of the second part of this question. So one way that perceptual reality monitoring might be implemented is that via kind of a hierarchical system. So previous theoretical accounts have taken inspiration from generative adversarial networks to explain how reality monitoring might be implemented in a hierarchical system. So in these GANs, you have two networks. You have a perceptual inference network, which you can kind of see as the ventral visual stream. So this is just perceptual processing as we know it from perception research. So that all happens at the back of the brain. But then there's a separate network which kind of monitors signals from this perceptual network and decides whether they are real or not. And this is the trick that GANs use to train efficient networks. So the idea is that these perceptual networks can generate samples based on latent representations, which you can kind of see as imagining something based on conceptual knowledge. And then these imagined samples are fed into a discriminator along with samples from the training set, so along with real samples. And then the goal of this generator is to ultimately fool the discriminator, so to create imagined samples that are as real as the training set. And by that point, that means that your perceptual inference system works very well. So you have a very good generative model of the outside world. So I really like thinking about reality monitoring in this context because it kind of puts it as an essential part of learning a generative perceptual model of the outside world. But another interesting thing of it is that it suggests that you need two kind of networks to do this. You need the perceptual network itself, and then you need the monitoring thing, that the discriminator that monitors these signals to decide about reality. And also separate lines of research also suggest that there might be a dedicated reality monitoring system in the brain. So this comes from reality monitoring research of memory, so source monitoring research, where researchers have looked at how people decide whether something they remember actually happened or was maybe something they imagined or dreamed about. And when you look at, a meta-analysis of these kinds of studies, what you consistently see is that the specific region in the prefrontal cortex seems to be involved. So thinking these two ideas together, what we've recently suggested is that maybe the way perceptual reality monitoring is implemented is in this kind of hierarchical system where these frontal regions evaluate more low-level sensory signals, maybe also other kinds of signals, to decide whether something reflects reality or imagination. Now, within this kind of hierarchical framework, reality monitoring errors can arise from different issues within this system. So, for example, when you are actually imagining something, but for some reason you get very strong sensory signals, so sensory hyperactivity because of some issues in sensory processing, then this could lead to a hallucination or a false reality monitoring judgment. In that case, your reality monitoring evaluation system is still intact, but the issue is really with the sensory signals. So that's one way in which you could get a hallucination. Another way is maybe your sensory processing still works very well, but there's something wrong with your monitoring system, the discriminator in this case. And that could also lead to a hallucination. And this might distinguish between kind of non-clinical and clinical issues of hallucinations, where in the non-clinical case, you have specific sensory issues, but you are in general still able to do proper reality monitoring, whereas in the clinical case, maybe reality monitoring itself is disrupted, which would lead to more widespread symptoms. So this is something that we're starting to think about right now. So I'm just looking at the time. It's about 45. How long do we have? Do we have an hour in total? Because then maybe it's good to kind of... Yeah, it's an hour in total. Right?
We're very flexible. So it can be an hour, a bit more, a bit less. It's very...
Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm just thinking about whether I should talk a bit about the model or not. Maybe a little bit, a few more minutes. Okay. So we are recently thinking about kind of implementing this idea in a hierarchical Bayesian system where you basically have two parts like this model. So you have one content state, which basically infers the content of your sensory signals. So what am I looking at? So very much ventral visual stream processing. What does this signal represent? And then you have a higher order kind of awareness or reality state that monitors these contents and these sensory signals to determine whether they reflect reality, imagination, or just noise. And we've observed some preliminary evidence in line with this idea of two separate systems within the brain. So for example, we analyzed a previously collected fMRI data set in which participants imagined stimuli and rated the vividness of the imagery, and they also perceived these same stimuli at threshold and then rated the visibility of their perception. And what we found was that the same set of frontal regions, so over here, the same set of frontal regions indeed seem to monitor both imagery vividness as well as perceptual visibility. And then we found that the content of the imagery and perception, so what people were imagining and perceiving, was specifically represented in the early visual cortex. So indeed, this is in line with the idea that you might have two separate kind of systems, one that determines the content of your perception and the other one that determines the kind of the strength or the reality of that content. So a separate line of neuroimaging experiments, which is kind of indirectly related with that we've done, is focused on the separate coding of content and awareness of this content. So this is not whether it's real or imagined, but just whether it's real, whether we perceive it at all or not. And we seem to find similar brain areas where, you know, this is just a discrimination task, and then the identity of the stimulus is represented in occipital cortex, whereas the visibility or the vividness or the strength of this experience seems to be better correlated with these more prefrontal areas. And you know, in all of these experiments, we randomized button response mapping, so it's not a motor response or anything like that. It seems to be something these frontal regions somehow kind of monitor strength or visibility in some way. And this might then feed back into a kind of reality monitoring system. So we're currently trying to do a study where in fMRI, you know, where we actually have this distinction between imagery and perception, but obviously we can't do a one trial fMRI experiment. So we made some adjustments. So hopefully we'll get some results about actual reality judgments soon, and would be really interesting to see whether the similar frontal regions are involved in that. So to conclude, imagination is implemented as running the visual system backwards. And because of the neural architecture of the visual system, this causes imagery to be less vivid than perception. Now, because imagery and perception do rely on the same system, they can sometimes be confused, and sensory strength might be one way in which they can be dissociated. And perceptual reality monitoring as a whole could be efficiently implemented within a neural hierarchy where these high-level frontal regions evaluate sensory precision and maybe other factors like cognitive control or context to decide whether some sensory signal represents reality or not. Now, if you're interested in any of these analyses that I talked about, almost all the code and the data for all of these studies can be found on my GitHub, and I'm always open to collaborating or talking more about this. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I will let Frédéric manage the question because I don't see the room very well, but I just want to say it was really, really good. It was an amazing talk. I learned a lot because it's far from my expertise, but I was touching my screen and tried to understand everything. It was really, really well explained. Thanks a lot.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. That's nice to hear. Thanks.
Thank you. So questions? Yes.
Maybe I have like a clarification question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So thank you for your so interesting conference. So the clarification question is on the layer 4. I didn't get if it was a hypothesis or if it was something that have been such like an evidence. I didn't get it. Yeah,
so that's a really good question. So it is. There's some evidence that suggests that there's no imagined representation in layer 4, but it's also something that we just know about how the architecture of the brain works. Is that the input comes into layer 4, whereas the feedback goes into outer layers. And there's some evidence from visual working memory where you also don't see middle layer activity. So there's quite some preliminary. There's quite some evidence, but it's a very new field doing this layer from right. Yeah.
So your experiments doesn't really inform this at some point.
No. So our experiments, I guess, inform whether this signal could be used for reality monitoring. So I guess, so it might be that there's a difference in layer 4 activity. I think there probably is during imagery and perception. But then the second question is, does that mean that we never confuse the two? And it seems that that doesn't mean that, because we can get people to confuse the two.
Okay. Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Definitely.
Okay. Cool.
And okay. I have a question regarding the complexity of the stimuli that you're using for those experiments.
Or the lack of. Sorry.
Oh, the design is clear.
Yeah, it's so cool design.
No, it is a really great design, but I was wondering if there is already any work or if you're planning on doing any work to see how applicable the findings that you have now from the rather simple stimuli is on more complex stimuli, also maybe moving things and like just thinking about what people can imagine.
Yeah, that's so you choose such simple stimuli that then we were more confident that we could get people to mistake the two, because if you start imagining more complicated things, it's going to be way harder to make it as good as perception, right? So I think it's a super valid point and definitely something we need to investigate. I think the effects should still be there. I think the same principle holds, but I think the vividness of more complicated, I know the vividness of more complicated imagery is lower. So that means that according to our hypothesis, that means it's harder to get them to confuse them for reality, which I think would be the case. But yeah, we need to investigate that, but that's just my initial hunch on how that would work.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much. Very nice, interesting speech. I really liked it. I wanted to ask, like, as you said, like there is a subtle difference between imagination and perception, and let's say perception is stronger in terms of what is imposing, what we can feel when we perceive something in reality compared to the imagination. But I wanted to know, for example, even though they have this like difference of like intensity, let's say perception is stronger, like more intense than imagination. And are they really, for example, is imagination less stimulating? For example, are these two, perception and imagination, are able to modify in the same way, for example, neurophysiological measurements, like let's say heartbeat or whatever, regardless of vividness?
I don't know about regardless of vividness, but there's quite a lot of cool research on, for example, pupil response to imaginary light. That's one thing I really love. No, I know about vividness. So, when you present a light stimulus, you see something light, then your pupil constricts. The same thing happens when you imagine a light stimulus compared to when you imagine a dark stimulus. You also get a pupil response. And I think there's one preprint of this year coming out that relates to the imagery vividness. So the more vivid you imagine your bright stimulus, the more your pupil contracts. Yeah.
I think, for example,
there's also research on like the skin conductance, for example, the fear response to perceived stimuli or imagined stimuli, and then you get similar things when you're seeing something scary, then you get your skin response, and when you're imagining something scary, you get a similar effect. And this seems to be reduced in people with aphantasia who say they cannot imagine. So people with aphantasia say they don't see anything when they're imagining, and when you ask them to imagine scary things, you also don't see a skin response. So I don't know if that was answering your question.
Exactly. So if, like, for example, if I say, if I'm like asked to imagine a wolf, for example, that is attacking me, if I cannot visualize it, I'm not going to fight it.
Exactly.
So
that's the idea.
Like conceptual, it's more to see, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So my way of thinking about it is that the more sensory, the more pictorial your mental imagery is, the more real it feels, and all the consequences that go with that, like your skin response and all of those things. So the closer it gets to really experiencing it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Isn't there a classical finding that if you think about a lemon, you start salivating?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not surprised. Yeah.
Thanks.
There's also a question on Zoom. There is a question on Zoom also, Natalie.
Yes, hi. Thank you for the talk. I was just wondering, because every time I'm hearing you talking about the difference between perception and reality, because I'm studying how smells can interact with our perception of reality. I'm always thinking, because most of the study is always based, because of course your question is about visual, like how can you imagine visually object. But during study I've made in relation to how people were interacting with smells in the environment, I went. Sorry, my English is escaping me. There was some people about a phantom smell. Well, they were, for example, we were walking and they were seeing garbage, but there was not that signal that it was smelling. So I'm just always wondering, because the world we are living in, it's not only visual, of course, but people make representation of things that when you encounter input like smell, sound, everything. So it's kind of for me, I'm just translated it like a harmony so there's something that are more present, like more visual, other, like it's a harmony gamme d'harmonie. Sorry, I'm really confusing. I'm not good at asking questions.
That's okay.
So the thing is, I'm always wondering when you are doing study like that, of course, to say, and I agree with, I find your study very interesting and very, very inclusive. I mean, it makes really sense. But I think it would be interesting to see that way of how maybe instead of like how can we visualize smells, not only like think visually, you know. I think that it would give a lot of more how do you say, donner de la chair à, comment on dit ça en anglais?
Provide more information or provide
like
no, 100%,
I guess, because it's like because smells are not something that you can define visually, but people do, because it relates to things like a smell of garbage it's linked to a garbage bag that you see. Even if the smell is not there, you perceive it. The person perceive it and persuade herself that it was smelling and receive the input and imagine
that's really interesting.
But the input is not there. So it's very
100%. Yes. Yeah. So if I understood you correctly, there's like two things that I kind of I'm latching onto in what you're saying. So one is whether this holds for different modalities. So auditory imagery, smell imagery, gustatory, taste imagery. And I don't know, and that's indeed something we definitely need to investigate. There's some auditory Perky effect, for example. There's some things in the auditory domain. But that's definitely something worth investigating. Another thing is that maybe multimodal imagery. So what you're saying is, if when you see a garbage bag, you kind of have an imagery of the smell, and then it might be harder to distinguish that from reality. So I think that's something that would be really interesting. And another thing I'm thinking about looking into is more involuntary imagery that's kind of externally triggered rather than something you're doing yourself. So maybe, you know, a different modality could be one of the ways in which you have other kinds of imagery triggered, and then that might have more force to it than something that you're just grabbing from thin air, kind of. So definitely.
In regard to imagery. And also I was just sorry to take time, I was just thinking also, have you ever consider like the feelings regarding to perception and imaginary? Like, for example, someone very important to you had died, and you really wanted to be there, like kind of a ghost imagery. I don't know how to say it, but you know, the feeling is so strong that you really wanted to be that object, that person there that you are imagining, and you are persuading yourself that it's in the environment.
Excusez-moi, peut-être que vous pourriez poursuivre cette discussion avec la conférencière en ligne, parce qu'il y a...
ok, c'est bon. Ok. Sorry, I was just like...
I don't know what happened, but sure. I don't speak any French, but maybe he was saying there's other people should also ask questions.
Oh, it's just... I have too much question. That's fine.
You just ask if you can continue pursue your discussion by email or so, because other person have questions.
Okay.
So it's good.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ici en classe. Catherine, no. I have a sort of a question that might be constrained as a comment. But are you absolutely sure in your nature communication experiment that your subjects were actually imagining the Gabor in the noise during the imagination part of the experiment? So before the trick trial at the very end.
I mean, in the sense that they provided vividness ratings that varied. It could be that they just pressed random buttons, but then I don't think we would expect to find any congruency effects or condition effects.
Right, but another possibility is that they were actually seeing on some trials something that looked somewhat like your Gabor in some of these trials. Because noise is not always the same. It varies, and on some trials, I'm certain.
Oh yeah, so no, we made it to be the same in all trials.
The noise was always exactly the same?
Yeah.
Same sequence?
Yes. On purpose, for that exact reason.
Okay, excellent.
Wait, so it was exactly the same noise patch. All the pixels were the same.
Yeah, the same sequence. So it was dynamic, but all the sequence was the same for every trial, for every participant. Yeah. Yeah, so because we wanted to prevent these kind of effects of, yeah. Thanks.
I have just a really quick follow-up. So I'm wondering why, I mean, it's not really a follow-up, but you've shown and others have shown that what's going on in the brain during imagination and perception is very distinct in terms of direction of information flow, right? No?
Yeah. So sorry. So a little bit. Yeah. So I think how I see it is that everything that's happening during imagery is also happening during perception, but not the other way around. So kind of you see all the feedback processing during perception.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like it's distinct in some sense, but there's also some overlap, as in feedback processing is shared.
Right, early on, it's very different.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. No, that's true.
So if you have a system that's monitoring or discriminating between reality and imagination, why doesn't such a system just use the direction of information flow to
yeah, so it's a good question. I've been trying to figure out how it could do that, right? So then you might have
the motion detector.
Yeah, for example, yeah. So I was thinking about that. Do you have some region that's like, okay, if activity is first in V1 and then in IT, and you integrate between the two? Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. It's definitely possible. I think that could be an alternative hypothesis. And then maybe if we present dynamic noise, maybe that's enough to fool that kind of directionality inference. Yeah, that's a possibility for sure. It's an interesting one. Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know if my question is here, but I was wondering if, so your work is about visual imagery, and I was wondering if you knew any research or studies about this kind of imagery, but with people with visual impairments or blind from birth. If it's present, different, absent.
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about it, but I know some people in Italy, and I'm very bad at names, so there's of no use to you. There's been some research on mental imagery in congenitally blind people, and they do describe their experience similar to sighted people. So they use similar metaphors, which is super interesting. So that's one thing that is pretty interesting. And another thing is that people who start turning blind sometimes start hallucinating. So that's this syndrome, Charles Bonnet syndrome. Maybe you're familiar with this. Is that sometimes people, when they start turning blind, their sensory processing kind of goes AWOL, and they start hallucinating things, really vivid hallucinations. So they see people or scenes super vivid that aren't there. And this is really interesting because usually this is accompanied by insight. So people know that these things are not real, they see them as if they're really real. So that's really interesting. It's not maybe not really an answer to your question, but it's just an interesting fact.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe it's not a real question, it's more an opening discussion about the lucid dreams. So there was this study about the circles that you imagine, you know this one, that you have your eyes that jump in.
Yeah, I know that one.
You
So
know what I
weird.
mean?
Yeah, the
Okay,
smooth pursuit one. The smooth pursuit one. You mean?
Yeah,
super.
I really loved it because then there is this fusion between imagination and perception that also we can see in the night terrors. Like it's so real for the person. So like in your conclusion, you say imagination and reality can be confused. But the question, like I think the philosophical question of what is reality, but that we create it. And so at some point, it was just to, I don't know, just to make this remark on this point that, yeah, at some point when you imagine and it's becoming vivid and even confusion, maybe it's also, it becomes a kind of reality for a person.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So for those of you who are not familiar with this study, please. Oh, sorry, is there?
No, and physiological responses that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. No, 100%. So for those of you not familiar with the study, please correct me if I'm wrong. But the idea is that, when you make you can make a smooth pursuit with your eyes only when you have a moving target. You can't do this voluntary. That's just not how our system works. So you need to track something in the external world. And they ask people in lucid dreams, so when they become aware of dreaming, to kind of do a smooth pursuit on a moving target. So to imagine a moving target and then smooth pursue it. And they found that they had this smooth pursuit eye movement as if it was really there. And this is something you can't do voluntary. So they had a control condition when these people were awake to ask them to do the same thing for imagery. Looked completely different. So it's really as if this dream world, for like your whole system was treating it as an external reality, which is, mind blowing. I agree. So I think this is a really good example that we can mix the two up.
Make the link with your models. Like it's true that but maybe it was also to be able to test it, as we said, that the design was really cool and really sharp. But at the same time that the model can be more complex of this as a loop of reinforcement.
100%.
And at some point it becomes almost a perception. I'm just.
Yeah, so 100%. So I think this. Yeah. So no, I think this loop of reinforcement is really interesting, and that's something that we could kind of put into here. So I don't know if you see my slides here. You can have an arrow back, basically, right? So the idea would be that once you infer a sensory signal to be real, you can then amplify that signal, and this can like iteratively lead to strengthening of your experience. So in line with kind of a predictive processing thing where you get a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Layer at some point.
Sorry?
And maybe to involve the fourth layer at some point.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. Fool the whole system. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll ask another question. So we in the lab with Vincent Tachereau-Dumouchel, Yann Charret, and Catherine Landry and other students that are here, like Hugo, we've done a series of experiments where we looked at the correlation between vividness for particular images and the threshold for discriminating these images, these same images. And so these images were natural images, natural scenes, so very complex compared to what you've used. And we found very small, if any, correlation between thresholds and vividness, or sensitivity, if you prefer, and vividness ratings. So do you have any thoughts about that?
So was the vividness about imagining these scenes or just?
Yeah, so the design was very simple. We showed participants two scenes, one after the other, and then we asked them to imagine the first one or the second one in the imagination task, and in the other task, they had to say which of the two was presented to them in noise.
And you saw that there was not really a relationship between the vividness and the discrimination sensitivity over participants.
Very small. Within participant, and Yeah.
So we find, oh, that's interesting. So with the gratings, we find a negative correlation between participants. So people who have more, who say that their imagery of the gratings is more vivid, have worse discrimination sensitivity. And you're saying that you don't really see any effect within
They have
participants.
worse sensitivity when the
Imagery is vivid. Yeah, and I'm also not sure how to make sense of it, honestly. So I'm not sure. So our model is very much about detection, as in like the strength, and I'm still trying to figure out how we expect that to relate to discrimination, because that's a slightly different threshold, right? That's a different computation. So
sort of, but you would expect it to go the other way around, though.
I think I'm not sure what you would expect, honestly, because in signal detection, these two are independent, right? It's the criterion and the sensitivity that are independent. So, oh, you're away. I don't know. You turned black. I don't know why. Oh, you're back again. Yeah. So I'm honestly not sure. It's something I need to think about more. How I would expect that to be related. Thanks.
Questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much for this excellent presentation. I think